Across the western plains, where the American frontier stretched endlessly beneath a relentless sun, there existed a truth that few dared to speak aloud. It was a truth written in chains and silence, in the bowed heads of the conquered and the calloused indifference of the victorious. On a cattle ranch that sprawled across the valley like a claim staked against the very earth itself, a young Apache woman knelt in the dirt with iron cuffs binding her wrists. Her black hair fell forward, obscuring a face that had learned to hide behind shadow. Her eyes remained fixed downward, never meeting the gaze of those who walked past. Her shoulders trembled not from cold but from the weight of a dignity stripped away, of a people displaced, of a self that had been reduced to property in the ledger of conquest. The ranch hands regarded her as one might regard a stray animal, useful for labor, unworthy of consideration beyond function. But in the moment when the ranch owner, a weathered man whose past bore the scars of war and the burden of guilt he could not name, approached her for the first time with intention rather than indifference, something shifted in the air between them. He did not see a captive. He saw a human being. When his rough hand reached out and gently lifted her chin upward, forcing her gaze to meet his own, the iron shackles remained unchanged. But the chains that truly mattered, the ones forged from shame and subjugation, began to crack. What followed was not a simple tale of rescue or redemption, but something far more complex. It was a story of two people, standing on opposite sides of history's deepest wounds, attempting to find their way towards something that resembled understanding, perhaps even healing, in a world determined to keep them apart. The ranch stretched for miles beneath the unforgiving sky, a patchwork of grazing land and fenced corrals where cattle moved in slow, deliberate herds. Wooden structures rose from the earth with the practical ugliness of buildings meant only for survival. The main house stood 2 stories tall, its paint peeling in the heat, its windows reflecting the hard light of afternoon. Beyond the immediate compound, the land rolled in gentle waves toward distant mesas that marked the edge of what had once been Apache territory. Now those lands belonged to settlers, to ranchers who measured their worth in acres claimed and livestock branded. The boundary between the world of the white settlers and the displaced tribes had been drawn not in ink but in blood, enforced by cavalry and codified by treaties that held no honor. The ranch owner was a man named Samuel Garrett, 43 years old, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. He had come west after the war, after wearing Union blue and watching men die in fields whose names he tried to forget. The ranch had been his father's before him, expanded through purchase and claim after the Apache campaigns had driven the tribes from their ancestral hunting grounds. Samuel worked the land with the grim determination of a man trying to outrun ghosts, rising before dawn and collapsing into bed long after sunset, his hands perpetually marked by rope burns, and his back aching from labor that never ended. He employed 6 ranch hands, rough men who drank hard and spoke little, who saw the world in simple terms of us and them, of civilized and savage. The young woman had been brought to the ranch 3 months earlier. Her name, as recorded in Samuel's ledger, was simply the Apache girl, though she had been born with a name her mother had given her, a name she no longer spoke aloud. She was 19 years old, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone far older. She had been taken during a raid on an Apache encampment, separated from her family, passed between military posts until she ended up as unpaid labor on Samuel's ranch, a common practice that few questioned and fewer challenged. The law, such as it was in those territories, considered her a ward, a dependent, a problem to be managed through forced assimilation. In practice, she was property. She slept in a small storage shed behind the main barn, on a pile of hay covered by a single thin blanket. Her days began before sunrise and ended long after dark. She hauled water, mucked stables, fed livestock, and performed whatever tasks the ranch hands deemed beneath their own dignity. She moved through these duties in silence, her face a mask of careful neutrality, her body language speaking only of submission. When the men spoke to her, which was rarely, they used short commands as if addressing an animal. When they looked at her, which was often, their eyes held either contempt or something worse, a hunger she had learned to avoid by making herself invisible. Samuel had not wanted her on his property. When the cavalry officer had arrived with paperwork assigning her to his ranch, He had argued, but only briefly. "You either take her, or she goes to someone who'll work her harder," the officer had said. And that had been the end of it. For the first 2 months, Samuel had kept his distance, treating her presence as he would any other unpleasant necessity of ranch life. He told himself she was being fed, sheltered, kept safer here than she would be elsewhere. He told himself this was mercy, though the word tasted like ash. But Samuel was not a man entirely at peace with the compromises he had made. Late at night, when sleep eluded him and the darkness pressed close, he remembered faces from the war, remembered the Apache campaigns he had participated in before mustering out, remembered villages burning, and women screaming, and children running through smoke. He had done what he was ordered to do. He had survived. And survival, he had learned, required a certain hardening of the heart, a willingness to stop asking questions that had no good answers. Yet whenever he passed by the Apache girl working in the yard, her head bowed and her movements mechanical, something in his chest tightened. She reminded him of things he wanted to forget. She reminded him that mercy was not the same as justice, and that silence in the face of cruelty was its own form of participation. The ranch hands called her squaw when they thought Samuel could not hear, and sometimes even when he could. They laughed at her stumbling attempts to understand their commands. They kicked dirt at her feet when she walked past. Samuel said nothing. He told himself it was not his place to police every interaction, that he had a ranch to run, and that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. But the tightness in his chest grew stronger with each passing day, until he could no longer pretend he did not notice, could no longer pretend he did not care. The young woman lived in a prison of imposed silence. She spoke no English when she arrived, and no one made any effort to teach her beyond the handful of words necessary for her labor. Stay, come, work, stop. She learned these words the way an animal learns commands, through repetition and consequence. But inside that silence, her mind remained her own. She thought in Apache, dreamed in Apache, prayed in Apache to spirits she feared might no longer hear her prayers. She remembered her mother's face, her father's voice, her younger brother's laughter. She remembered the smell of sage smoke and the taste of roasted venison and the feeling of belonging to a people and a place. Those memories were all she had left, and she guarded them fiercely, protecting them from the erosion of daily humiliation. She watched the white men carefully, learning their patterns, understanding their hierarchies. She saw that the ranch owner was different from the others, that he carried himself with a kind of tired authority rather than casual cruelty. But she did not trust him. Why would she? He owned the chains that bound her. He signed the papers that kept her imprisoned. Whatever gentleness might exist in his eyes was irrelevant in the face of the fundamental violence of her situation. She kept her head down, not out of respect, but out of survival. To meet a white man's gaze was to invite trouble. To speak was to risk punishment. To exist visibly was to make yourself a target. So she made herself small and silent and invisible, and counted the days until she might find a way to escape, knowing that escape likely meant death in a land where her people were hunted and her face marked her as enemy. It was on a Tuesday in late summer, when the first crack appeared in the wall between them. The sun hung white and merciless in a cloudless sky, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The young woman was hauling buckets of water from the well to the horse troughs, a task that required dozens of trips in the suffocating heat. She had been at it for hours, her dress soaked through with sweat, her arms trembling from exhaustion. On one trip, dizzy from heat and thirst, her foot caught on an uneven stone and she fell forward, the bucket spilling and her knee striking hard against the ground. Before she could push herself up, one of the ranch hands, a man named Dwight with tobacco-stained teeth and a perpetual sneer, was standing over her. "You clumsy savage," he spat. "Can't even walk straight." He grabbed her roughly by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh as he yanked her to her feet. She bit back a cry, her face carefully blank. The other ranch hands watched with idle amusement, waiting to see what Dwight would do next. He shoved her toward the well. "Go fetch another bucket and stop wasting water." She stumbled but did not fall again, moving quickly toward the well with her head down. Samuel had been working in the barn when he heard Dwight's raised voice. He emerged into the yard just in time to see the young woman being shoved. Something hot and sharp flared in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. He walked across the yard, his boots raising small clouds of dust. Dwight saw him coming and released his grip on the girl's arm, stepping back with a casual shrug as if nothing of consequence had occurred. "Everything all right here?" Samuel asked, though it was not really a question. His voice was level, but carried an edge that made Dwight straighten. "Just teaching her to watch where she's going, boss," Dwight replied. "Clumsy as a newborn calf, this one." Samuel looked at the young woman. She stood by the well, with her eyes fixed on the ground, her body tense, waiting for the next blow or command. He noticed the way she favored her right leg, the torn fabric at her knee where blood was beginning to seep through. He noticed the red marks on her arm where Dwight's fingers had gripped her. He noticed, perhaps for the first time truly noticed, that she was a person who was afraid and hurt and utterly alone. "Get back to work," he told Dwight and the others. The ranch hands dispersed slowly, casting curious glances back as they went. Samuel remained standing a few feet from the young woman. She had not moved, had not looked up. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the quick, shallow breaths that spoke of someone bracing for violence. He walked to the well and drew up a fresh bucket of water. Then, without a word, he carried it to the horse trough and emptied it himself. He returned to the well and drew another bucket. This time he brought it to where the young woman stood. He set it down at her feet, then walked a few paces away to give her space. He gestured to the bucket, then to her, then made a drinking motion with his hand. She looked at the bucket, then at him, her expression wary and confused. Was this a test? A trap? Samuel waited. Finally, slowly, she knelt and cupped water in her hands, bringing it to her lips. She drank deeply, greedily, as if she had not had clean water in days. Samuel watched, and the tightness in his chest became something close to pain. When she finished drinking, she remained kneeling, waiting for him to tell her what to do next. Instead, Samuel walked away, back toward the barn, leaving her there with a bucket of water. But before he disappeared into the shadows of the barn door, he glanced back once. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, no more than a heartbeat, before she quickly looked away. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but perhaps the recognition that understanding might be possible. Perhaps the first tentative acknowledgement that they were both, in their different ways, trapped by circumstances larger than themselves. That night, lying in his bed unable to sleep, Samuel thought about the war. He thought about a day 15 years earlier, when his unit had been ordered to clear an Apache village suspected of harboring warriors who had raided supply lines. They had ridden in at dawn, weapons drawn, and found mostly women, children, and old men. The warriors were gone, hunting, or already fled. His commanding officer had ordered the village burned anyway, as a message. Samuel remembered standing beside his horse, watching the flames consume wickiups, watching people flee with whatever they could carry, watching a young mother clutching an infant to her chest as she ran. He had not lit any of the fires himself, but he had not stopped them either. He had done his duty. He had followed orders. He had told himself it was war, and in war, such things were necessary. Now, in the darkness of his bedroom, with the memory of the Apache girl's frightened eyes fresh in his mind, he wondered what necessary really meant. He wondered if survival required the death of conscience, or if there was another way, a harder way, a way that demanded more courage than simply following orders. He thought about his own daughter, who would have been about the Apache girl's age had she lived past her 5th birthday, had the fever not taken her 12 years ago. He thought about how he would have wanted someone to treat his daughter if circumstances had been reversed, if she had been the one alone and afraid and at the mercy of strangers. The thought settled over him like a heavy blanket, smothering and undeniable. He could not undo the past. He could not bring back villages he had helped destroy or restore lives he had helped shatter. But perhaps he could choose differently now. Perhaps small mercies, offered late, were still worth offering. The next morning, Samuel rose before dawn as always, but instead of heading immediately to the fields, he went to the shed where the Apache girl slept. He knocked on the door, a gesture that surprised him even as he did it. Who knocked on the door of a prisoner? But he did it anyway, and waited. When she emerged, blinking in the pre-dawn light, He handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was bread, cheese, and dried meat, more food than she had been allotted. He also handed her a small tin cup. "For water," he said, gesturing to it. "Keep it." She took the bundle and the cup, her expression unreadable, her eyes still cast down. But her hands trembled slightly as she held them, and Samuel chose to believe it was not only from fear. He nodded to her, then walked away to begin his day's work. It was a small gesture, absurdly small in the face of everything else, but it was something. And sometimes, in a world built on cruelty, something was enough to begin with. Over the following weeks, Samuel began to change the way he treated the young woman. He made sure she had adequate food and clean water. He moved her sleeping quarters from the storage shed to a small room in the bunkhouse usually reserved for transient workers, a space with a real bed and a door that locked from the inside. When the ranch hands protested, he silenced them with a look. When they questioned his judgment, he reminded them who paid their wages. He did not explain his reasoning because he was not entirely sure he could put it into words. He only knew that the alternative, continuing as they had been, had become intolerable. He also began to teach her English. Not in any formal way, but through patient repetition during her daily work. He would point to objects and name them, then wait for her to repeat the words. Table, horse, sky, water. She was hesitant at first, suspicious of any interaction that required her voice. But gradually, as she realized he was not mocking her attempts or punishing her mistakes, she began to participate. Her accent was thick and her pronunciation uncertain, but she learned quickly. Language she understood was power. Every word she acquired was a small tool she might use to navigate this foreign world. Samuel, in turn, asked her to teach him words in Apache. It was an unusual request, one that visibly surprised her. But she complied, teaching him simple words. Sky, water, horse. The same words, in different sounds. He repeated them carefully, mangling the pronunciation, and she almost smiled once before catching herself. Almost. These exchanges happened in fragments, stolen moments between tasks. They were brief and awkward, conducted in mixed languages and pantomime. But they were exchanges nonetheless, conversations in the most basic sense, and they represented something neither of them had expected, the possibility of connection across an unbridgeable divide. One evening, as the sun set in bands of orange and purple across the western horizon, Samuel brought his evening meal outside and ate sitting on the porch steps. The young woman was finishing her work in the yard, sweeping dirt from in front of the barn. On impulse, Samuel called out to her. When she approached, wary as always, he gestured to the empty space beside him on the steps and then to the plate of food he had brought out. It was more than he could eat. He divided the food onto 2 plates and offered one to her. She hesitated, clearly uncertain of his intentions. But hunger and the smell of warm food proved stronger than caution. She sat, not beside him, but on the ground a few feet away, and ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might be taken away. They ate in silence, watching the sun sink below the mesas. When they finished, she gathered both plates without being asked and took them inside to wash. Samuel remained sitting on the steps, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly, but perhaps the distant cousin of peace. Inside the confines of Samuel's mind, a battle raged. He was not naive enough to believe that kindness erased injustice or that personal decency could substitute for systemic change. The young woman was still not free. She was still bound to his property by legal documents and military enforcement. He still benefited from her labor. These facts remained true regardless of how gently he spoke to her or how much food he provided. He struggled with the dissonance between his growing sense of responsibility toward her and his complicity in the very system that had made her his responsibility in the first place. He thought about releasing her, simply letting her go. But where would she go? The nearest Apache reservation was 100 miles away across hostile territory, patrolled by soldiers who shot first and investigated later. Letting her walk away would likely mean her death. And if he did not report her absence, he would face legal consequences, perhaps even accusations of aiding the enemy. The frontier had rules, and those rules were enforced with violence. So he did what he could within the constraints of an unjust system. He treated her with dignity. He spoke to her as a person. He created small spaces of autonomy within her captivity. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was more than most would do. And for now, it was all he knew how to offer. The young woman, for her part, remained deeply conflicted. Samuel's increasing kindness confused her. She did not know what to make of a captor who tried to learn her language, who shared his food, who looked at her as if she were human. Part of her wanted to trust him, to believe that not all white men were the same, that maybe this one was different. But another part of her, the part that remembered her father's teachings and her people's history, warned her that this was a trick, a manipulation, a way to make her compliant and grateful for her own subjugation. She thought often of escape. She studied the patterns of the ranch, noting when the hands were absent, where the horses were kept, which directions led toward water and which led only to empty desert. But she also knew her chances of survival alone were slim. And increasingly, disturbingly, she found herself hesitating because of Samuel, because leaving would mean never understanding what was happening between them, never knowing if the humanity she saw flickering in his eyes was real or imagined. She began to watch him when she thought he was not looking. She noticed the way he worked alongside his men rather than simply ordering them about. She noticed how he was quick to anger at cruelty but slow to laugh. She noticed the sadness that lived in the corners of his mouth, the way he sometimes stared at the horizon as if searching for something he had lost. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in her own reflection. One afternoon, she found him in the barn repairing a broken saddle. She stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt. He looked up and saw her, then gestured for her to enter. She approached slowly. He pointed to the saddle, then to the broken strap, then made a sewing motion. She understood. She had repaired leather before. She took the tools he offered and set to work, her fingers moving with practiced skill. Samuel watched for a moment, then nodded and returned to his own work on the opposite end of the barn. They worked in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the distant lowing of cattle. After a while, Samuel spoke, his voice quiet. "You do good work." She paused, the words surprising her. She looked up, and for the first time, she did not immediately look away when she met his gaze. "Thank you," she said in careful English. It was the first time she had spoken to him beyond repeating vocabulary words. Samuel smiled slightly, a sad sort of smile, and nodded. "You're welcome," he replied. The saddle was repaired. The moment passed, but something had shifted again. Another crack in the wall, another small step toward whatever strange understanding was growing between them. The town nearest to Samuel's ranch was called Redemption, though there was little redemption to be found within its dusty streets and weathered storefronts. It was a settlement of 100 souls, give or take, built around a general store, a saloon, a church, and a sheriff's office. The people of Redemption were hardscrabble survivors, most of them farmers or ranchers, or those who served farmers and ranchers. They were not unusually cruel by the standards of the frontier, but neither were they unusually kind. They believed in progress, in manifest destiny, in the God-given right of white settlers to claim and civilize the land. They believed the Apache were a problem that had been solved through superior force, and they did not waste much sympathy on the defeated. Samuel made the trip to town once every 2 weeks for supplies. He always went alone, preferring the solitude of the long ride to the company of his ranch hands. But on a Saturday in early autumn, he made a decision that would change everything. He brought the Apache girl with him. She rode behind him on his horse, holding loosely to his waist, her body tense with the strangeness of being outside the familiar boundaries of the ranch. Samuel could feel her tension, the way she held herself rigid, prepared for danger. He spoke to her as they rode, pointing out landmarks, naming them in English, and asking for the Apache words. Canyon, river, hill, tree. She answered quietly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. He did not know why he had brought her. Part of him wanted her to see something beyond the ranch, to have a few hours of something that resembled freedom, even if it was illusory. Another part of him, perhaps the more honest part, wanted the town to see her with him, to make a public statement about how she should be treated. It was a risk, but he was tired of hiding behind caution. When they rode into Redemption, heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stared openly at the sight of Samuel Garrett with an Apache woman sitting behind him on his horse. The young woman felt the weight of those stares and instinctively lowered her head, her body curling inward as if to make herself smaller. But Samuel kept his back straight and his eyes forward, acknowledging the gawkers with curt nods but offering no explanations. He tied the horse outside the general store and helped the young woman dismount. She stood close to the horse, her hand resting on its flank as if the animal might protect her. Samuel gestured for her to follow him into the store. She hesitated, then obeyed, walking 2 steps behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. Inside, the storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, looked up from his ledger and his expression soured immediately. "Samuel," he said by way of greeting, his tone carefully neutral. "And your companion." The word was loaded with judgment. Samuel ignored the implication. "I need supplies," he said, producing a list, "and I need to outfit her properly. She needs a coat, boots, and a dress that fits." Henderson's eyebrows rose. "You're buying clothes for her? Might as well burn your money." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Just get what I asked for, Henderson." While Henderson grudgingly gathered the items, several townspeople had gathered outside the store's window, peering in with undisguised curiosity. The young woman stood in the corner, trying to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. Samuel saw the fear in her eyes, the way her breath came quick and shallow. He moved to stand between her and the window, blocking the view of the gawkers. "It's all right," he said quietly in English, then repeated it in his clumsy Apache. She looked at him, and for a moment her guard dropped enough for him to see, not just fear but gratitude. Henderson returned with the items, piling them on the counter with exaggerated care. "That'll be $12, he said, his tone making clear he thought Samuel was a fool. Samuel paid without complaint, then handed the bundle to the young woman. She took it, clutching it to her chest as if it were precious beyond measure. They left the store and stepped out into the street, where a small crowd had gathered. A man stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Marcus Thorne, a rancher whose land bordered Samuel's to the south. He was a tall man with a thick beard and hard eyes, known for his vocal opinions about how the Apache problem should have been solved with bullets rather than reservations. "Garrett," he called out, his voice carrying across the street. "You bringing savages into town now, setting a poor example for the rest of us." Samuel stopped walking. The young woman stood beside him, trembling but silent. Samuel turned to face Thorne. "She's under my care," he said evenly. "I'm responsible for her welfare. That includes clothing." Thorne spat into the dirt. "Your care? She's a ward, Garrett. Government property. You're supposed to work her, not coddle her. Next thing you know, you'll be inviting her to sit at your dinner table." Several people in the crowd laughed at that, a mean, ugly sound. Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "And what business is that of yours, Thorne? How I manage my property doesn't concern you." The words property tasted bitter, but he knew that any defense of the young woman that acknowledged her full humanity would only make things worse for both of them. "It concerns all of us when you start treating savages like they're white folk," Thorne shot back. "You're confusing them, making them think they're equal. That's dangerous. Dangerous and stupid." The young woman understood enough English by now to grasp the gist of the conversation. She understood that she was the subject of their argument, that her presence was causing Samuel trouble. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible again, but there was no escape. She stood frozen, wishing she could speak, wishing she could defend herself, wishing she were anywhere but here. Samuel took a step toward Thorne. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous register. "I fought in the war, Thorne. I did things I'm not proud of. But I came out the other side believing that cruelty for its own sake makes us less than we ought to be. You want to question how I run my ranch? Come talk to me in private. But you will not stand here and insult a person under my protection in the middle of this street. Do you understand me?" Thorne's face reddened. The crowd had gone silent, watching the confrontation with hungry eyes. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the threat of violence hanging thick in the air. Then Thorne shrugged elaborately, a gesture of dismissal rather than capitulation. "You've gone soft, Garrett," he said. "Mark my words, that softness will be your undoing." He turned and walked away, and the crowd slowly dispersed, muttering among themselves. Samuel stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, before turning back to the young woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. He could see she was shaking. "We're leaving," he said quietly. They walked back to the horse, and he helped her mount before swinging up in front of her. As they rode out of town, he could feel her pressed against his back, feel the trembling that she could not quite control. They were a mile outside Redemption when she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." It was in English, carefully pronounced. Samuel did not turn around, but he nodded. "You're welcome," he replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "I'm sorry for what happened back there." She did not respond, but her grip on his waist tightened slightly, and he understood that she had heard him. That night, back at the ranch, Samuel lay awake wondering what he had set in motion. By publicly defending the young woman, he had made himself a target for the town's disapproval. He had marked himself as someone who challenged the unspoken rules, someone whose sympathies lay in dangerous directions. There would be consequences. He knew that, but he found he did not regret it. For the first time in a long time, he had acted according to his conscience rather than his convenience. It felt precarious and frightening, and strangely liberating all at once. In her small room in the bunkhouse, the young woman sat on her new bed wearing her new dress, the coat folded carefully beside her. She touched the fabric, feeling its weight and warmth, and thought about the white man who had bought these things for her, who had stood between her and a hostile crowd, who had used words like protection when speaking of her. She did not understand him. She did not know if she should trust him. But she knew that something had changed between them today, something that could not be unchanged. For better or worse, their fates had become entangled. The weeks that followed the confrontation and Redemption were marked by a deepening tension. Word spread quickly through the surrounding ranches about Samuel's defense of the Apache girl, and opinions formed swiftly along predictable lines. Some thought him admirable, a man of principle standing against the casual cruelty of frontier justice. Most thought him foolish, dangerously soft, a man whose sentimentality would lead to ruin. A few thought him something worse, a traitor to his own kind, someone whose sympathies lay with the enemy. Samuel noticed the change in how people treated him. When he encountered neighbors at the boundaries of his property, their greetings grew shorter, their expressions cooler. When he needed to trade goods or services, prices seemed to rise and cooperation became harder to secure. The ranch hands on his own property began to question his decisions more openly, their respect eroding in the face of what they perceived as weakness. Samuel weathered this shift stoically, but it wore on him, adding weight to shoulders already burdened by doubt. The young woman, too, felt the change. The ranch hands who had previously ignored or casually abused her now watched her with open hostility. They resented the special treatment they perceived she was receiving. They resented Samuel's protection of her, and they resented the implication that their previous behavior had been wrong. Twice, Samuel had to intervene when he caught ranch hands deliberately making her work more difficult, once going so far as to fire a man named Pete who had kicked over a bucket she was carrying, laughing, as water spilled across her feet. The firing only made things worse. Now Samuel was not just eccentric, but actively undermining the social order. Now he was choosing an Apache over his own men. The remaining ranch hands worked in sullen silence, doing their jobs but without the camaraderie that had once existed. The ranch felt colder, more isolated, as if it had been quarantined from the rest of civilization. Through all of this, Samuel and the young woman continued their strange friendship, if that was even the right word for what existed between them. They shared meals more frequently now, sitting together in companionable silence or practicing their respective languages. Samuel learned that her name was not the Apache girl, but Claire, an anglicized version of her Apache name that she had chosen for herself as a bridge between worlds. He began to call her Claire, and she began to call him Samuel instead of sir or boss. These small intimacies felt enormous, weighted with significance neither of them could fully articulate. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel asked her about her life before the ranch. It was a question he had avoided until now, uncertain whether the answer would be too painful, uncertain whether he had the right to ask. But curiosity and genuine interest overcame his hesitation. She was quiet for a long time, and he thought perhaps she would not answer. Then she began to speak, slowly, in halting English supplemented with Apache words he did not know, painting a picture of a childhood spent moving with the seasons, following game, living in harmony with a land that white settlers saw only as empty space waiting to be filled. She spoke of her father, a warrior who had fought to protect their people, who had been killed in a cavalry raid when she was 15. She spoke of her mother, who had died of illness 2 winters later on the reservation where the survivors had been forced to live. She spoke of her younger brother, who she had not seen since the day she was taken, who might be alive or might be dead. She had no way of knowing. As she spoke, her voice remained steady, but tears slipped down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. Samuel listened without interrupting, his own chest tight with the weight of her losses. When she finished speaking, he said quietly, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For what happened to your family. For what my people did to yours. For what I did. I was part of it, you know. I rode with the cavalry. I followed orders. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself a lot of things." Claire looked at him, her eyes still wet with tears. "I know," she said. "I know what you were. I can see it in your eyes, the same thing I see in all the soldiers' eyes. Death and guilt." But she paused, searching for the right words. "But you see me now. You see me as person. Not all men do. That means something. Maybe not enough, but something." It was the longest conversation they had ever had, and the most honest. When it ended, they sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of shared understanding, of grief acknowledged, of two people recognizing the humanity in each other, despite everything that should have kept them apart. Winter approached, and with it came new challenges. The temperature dropped, snow dusted the mesas, and work on the ranch became harder. The cattle needed constant attention to keep them from freezing or starving. The water sources froze and had to be broken daily. Everyone worked longer hours, and exhaustion became the default state. In the midst of this, Samuel made another decision that shocked his remaining ranch hands. He moved Claire out of the bunkhouse and into a spare bedroom in the main house. The ranch hands were appalled. It was one thing to treat an Apache ward with basic decency, quite another to invite her into your home as if she were family. One of the men, a foreman named Jack, who had worked for Samuel's father, confronted him directly. "Boss," he said, his tone walking the line between respectful and insubordinate, "the men are talking. They're saying you've lost your mind. They're saying you've developed unnatural feelings for that girl. They're saying it's not right, her living in your house." Samuel's face hardened. "Let them talk," he said coldly. "She was freezing in that bunkhouse. I have empty rooms. It's practical." Jack shook his head slowly. "It's not about practical, boss. It's about appearances. People see what you're doing, and they draw conclusions. You're already on thin ice with the neighbors. This is going to make it worse." Samuel met his eyes. "Then it makes it worse. I'm not throwing her back into a freezing bunkhouse to protect my reputation." Jack sighed, recognizing a losing battle. "Your choice, boss. But don't say I didn't warn you." Claire's new room was small but warm, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. Samuel had given her blankets, a lamp, and privacy. For the first time since her capture, she had a space that was truly hers, a space where she could close a door and be alone. She wept the first night, overwhelmed by the strange mercy of it, confused by the man who would risk so much for her comfort. The winter deepened. Isolation became total as snow made travel dangerous. The ranch was cut off from town, from neighbors, from the outside world. It was just Samuel, Claire, and 3 ranch hands who stayed on out of either loyalty or lack of better options. In that isolation, the artificial boundaries that had governed Samuel and Claire's relationship began to dissolve. They spent evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the few books Samuel owned, with Samuel helping Claire improve her English and Claire teaching him more Apache. They played simple games, chess and cards, laughing at mistakes and celebrating small victories. They cooked meals together, shared stories, filled the long dark hours with companionship that felt increasingly natural. The ranch hands watched all of this with mounting concern and resentment. They whispered among themselves about the impropriety of it, about how the boss had clearly lost his moral compass, about how someone ought to report this situation to the authorities. But they did nothing, because jobs were scarce, and winter was harsh, and Samuel, for all his perceived failings, was still a fair employer who paid on time. One night, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Claire woke to the sound of breaking glass. She ran from her room and found Samuel in the kitchen, his hand bleeding where he had cut it on a broken cup. He was trying to wrap it with a cloth, but making a mess of it. Without thinking, Claire took his hand in hers, examining the cut with practiced eyes. She had learned healing from her mother, the art of using plants and pressure to mend wounds. She gestured for him to sit, then quickly gathered what she needed: clean cloth, water, a needle and thread she knew he kept for mending leather. She cleaned the wound carefully, her touch gentle but efficient. Samuel watched her face as she worked, seeing the concentration there, the competence, the kindness. When she had stitched the cut closed and bound it properly, she looked up and found him watching her. Their faces were close, their breath visible in the cold air of the kitchen. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them felt charged with possibility, with all the things they had not said, with feelings that had grown despite every reason they should not exist. Then Claire stepped back, releasing his hand. Samuel nodded his thanks, his voice rough. "You're skilled," he said. She shrugged. "My mother taught me. We had to know healing. The soldiers did not bring doctors for us." The simple statement carried volumes, a reminder of the vast gulf between their experiences, the injustices that no amount of personal kindness could erase. Samuel stood, cradling his bandaged hand. "Thank you, Claire." She nodded. "You are welcome, Samuel." They stood there for another moment, the broken glass glittering on the floor between them, before each retreated to their separate rooms, carrying with them the weight of what had almost happened and the complicated relief that it had not. Spring arrived slowly, thawing the land and bringing with it the promise of renewal. The ranch came back to life. Calves were born, fences were repaired, the cycle of work resumed. With the thaw came the return of the outside world. Neighbors began visiting again, travelers passed through, and word from town reached the ranch. The news was not good. Samuel learned that Marcus Thorne and several other ranchers had filed a formal complaint with the territorial authorities, claiming that Samuel was in violation of the terms of Claire's wardship, that he was treating her not as a laborer, but as a guest, and that this represented a dangerous precedent that undermined the system of management for Apache prisoners. An official would be coming to inspect the ranch, Samuel was informed. If the allegations were found to be true, Claire would be removed and reassigned to a different location, likely a harsher one, and Samuel would face fines and possible legal sanctions. Samuel received this news with grim resignation. He had known this day would come. He had known that his choices would eventually draw official scrutiny. But knowing did not make it easier. He told Claire what was happening, explained that men from the government would be coming, that they would ask questions and make judgments, that her fate hung in the balance. She listened without expression, her face carefully neutral in the way he had learned meant she was hiding fear. "What will you say?" she asked. "Will you tell them I am good worker? Will you tell them I obey?" Samuel shook his head. "I'll tell them the truth, that you're a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity, that I've done nothing I'm ashamed of." She looked at him with something like pity. "The truth will not help," she said quietly. "They do not want truth, they want compliance." She was right, of course. The truth was irrelevant to men who measured morality by adherence to systems designed to maintain power. But Samuel was tired of lies, tired of compliance, tired of being complicit in injustice through his silence. If they were going to punish him, let it be for doing the right thing rather than for playing along with the charade. The officials arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. There were three of them: a territorial administrator named Colonel Briggs, a military liaison named Lieutenant Foster, and a civilian observer named Mr. Whitmore, who represented the Indian Affairs Office. They were polite but cold, their purpose clear from the moment they dismounted their horses. Samuel greeted them formally and invited them into his house. Claire, as instructed, made herself scarce, working in the barn where she could be seen but not approached directly. The inspection was thorough and humiliating. They examined Claire's living quarters, interviewed the ranch hands, reviewed Samuel's ledgers and supply records. They asked pointed questions about Claire's duties, her treatment, her interactions with Samuel. The ranch hands, when questioned, gave carefully worded answers that neither defended nor condemned Samuel, protecting themselves by remaining neutral. Colonel Briggs, a man with steel gray hair and a permanent expression of disapproval, took notes in a leather journal, his pen scratching judgments onto paper with each observation. When they finally called Claire in to question her directly, Samuel asked to be present. The request was denied. Claire was led into the dining room alone, and the door was closed behind her. Samuel paced in the hallway outside, helpless and furious, while they interrogated her for over an hour. He could hear the murmur of voices, but could not make out words. He imagined them asking her leading questions, trying to trap her into admissions that would confirm their preconceived conclusions. When the door finally opened, Claire emerged pale and shaken. She would not meet Samuel's eyes as she walked past him and out of the house. The officials gathered their papers and prepared to depart. Colonel Briggs delivered their verdict in the front parlor. His tone brooks no argument. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "we find that you have failed to maintain appropriate boundaries in your management of the ward assigned to your care. You have provided her accommodations beyond what is necessary or advisable. You have developed a relationship with her that exceeds the bounds of propriety. While we find no evidence of criminal misconduct, we find clear evidence of poor judgment and inadequate supervision." Samuel stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he already knew. "It means," Colonel Briggs continued, "that the ward will be reassigned effective immediately. She will be transferred to the territorial work camp near Fort Benson, where she can be properly supervised and put to appropriate labor. You will be fined $200 for violation of wardship protocols. Consider yourself fortunate that we are not pursuing harsher sanctions." The room tilted. Fort Benson was notorious. The work camp there was little more than a prison, a place where Apache prisoners were worked to exhaustion and died from disease and neglect. Samuel had heard stories about Fort Benson, stories that made his blood run cold. "You can't send her there," he said, his voice rising. "That place is a death sentence. She's done nothing wrong. The fault is mine, not hers." "The fault is irrelevant," Colonel Briggs replied. "The decision is made. We will transport her tomorrow morning. I suggest you use this time to prepare her for departure and to settle your affairs. We will return at dawn." With that, the officials departed, leaving Samuel standing alone in his parlor, the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. He found Claire in the barn, sitting in an empty stall, her knees drawn to her chest. She looked up when he entered, and he saw in her eyes that she already knew. "They told you," she said. It was not a question. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He sat down beside her in the hay, propriety be damned, and they sat together in silence as the afternoon light slanted through the barn's cracks. "Fort Benson," she said finally, her voice flat. "I have heard of this place. People do not leave Fort Benson alive." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "I won't let them take you there," he said. "We'll figure something out. We'll run. I have money supplies. We can get you to the reservation, or to Mexico, somewhere safe." She shook her head slowly. "They will hunt us. They will catch us. And then it will be worse for both of us. You will lose everything, and I will still die, just in a different place." "Then what?" Samuel demanded, his voice breaking. "I just let them take you? I just watch them ride away with you tomorrow, knowing I'm sending you to your death? What kind of man does that make me?" She reached out and took his hand, the first time she had initiated such contact. "It makes you a man who tried," she said softly. "More than anyone else tried. More than I expected from someone like you." "That is not nothing, Samuel. That is something I will carry with me, whatever comes." They sat there until darkness fell. Two people who had crossed impossible distances to find each other, now faced with the inevitability of separation and all the cruelties that came with it. Samuel's mind raced through options, plans, desperate gambits. But every path he imagined led to worse outcomes. The system was too strong, the rules too entrenched. He was one man with a guilty conscience, and that was not enough to stand against the machinery of conquest and control. That night, Samuel did not sleep. He sat at his desk, writing letters, drafting protests, trying to find some legal avenue, some loophole, some way to stop what was coming. But he knew, even as he wrote, that it was futile. The law was not designed to protect people like Claire. The law was designed to control them, to use them, and ultimately to erase them. By the time the sun began to rise, he had a stack of worthless papers and no solutions. He went to Claire's room and knocked softly. She was already awake, already dressed, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap. She had packed nothing because she owned nothing worth packing except the clothes Samuel had bought her. She looked up when he entered, and the resignation in her eyes broke something in his chest. "I don't know how to stop this," he said, the admission tearing out of him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She stood and walked to him. "You gave me something no one else did," she said. "You saw me. You treated me like a person. For a little while, I was not just a thing to be used. That is a gift, Samuel. I will not forget it." The sound of horses approaching echoed across the morning air. The officials had returned. Samuel and Claire walked outside together. The ranch hands had gathered in the yard, watching in silence. Colonel Briggs sat atop his horse, looking down at them with the cold satisfaction of a man whose worldview had been confirmed. "The ward will come with us now, Mr. Garrett," he said. "Say your goodbyes." Samuel turned to Claire. "This isn't goodbye," he said fiercely. "I'll find a way to get you out. I'll write letters. I'll petition. I'll do whatever it takes. Don't give up. Promise me you won't give up." She smiled sadly. "I promise to try," she said. Then, before anyone could stop her, before anyone could object, she reached up and embraced him. It was a brief embrace, lasting only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Samuel held her tightly, memorizing the feeling, knowing it would have to last him whatever time they had left. When they parted, both had tears on their faces. Claire walked toward the waiting horses with her head held high, refusing to bow, refusing to let them see her broken. She mounted the horse they provided, and the group prepared to depart. It was then that the first arrow struck. It came from the east, from the hills beyond the ranch, a streak of motion that buried itself in the dirt 3 feet from where Colonel Briggs sat on his horse. Everyone froze. Then came a sound, a war cry that echoed across the valley, a sound Samuel had not heard in 15 years but recognized instantly. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, came riding down from the hills, weapons raised, faces painted, intent on one thing: rescuing their kin. Chaos erupted. The officials drew their weapons and shouted orders. The ranch hands scattered, running for cover. Samuel stood frozen between two terrible choices, watching as the warriors approached. He saw Claire on her horse, saw her face transformed by hope and fear, saw the moment of decision crystallize in her eyes. One of the warriors, a young man with a scar across his cheek, rode directly toward her, reaching out his hand. "Brother," Claire gasped, recognition flooding through her. Her younger brother, alive, grown, leading this desperate rescue. Gunfire erupted. Lieutenant Foster fired his rifle toward the approaching warriors. One of the ranch hands fired from the barn. Samuel watched in horror as violence bloomed around him. The thing he had fought so hard to prevent now manifesting in blood and screaming. Claire's brother reached her, grabbing the reins of her horse, preparing to wheel around and flee. But in that moment, Samuel saw something else. He saw Colonel Briggs, still mounted, raising his pistol, taking careful aim, not at Claire's brother but at Claire herself. A fleeing captive was not acceptable. Better a dead ward than one who escaped to tell others that rescue was possible. Samuel moved without thinking. He launched himself at Briggs, tackling him from his horse just as the pistol fired. The bullet went wide, striking nothing but air. Samuel and Briggs hit the ground hard, and then there were hands on Samuel, pulling him back, hitting him. He tasted blood. He heard Claire screaming his name. And then, through the confusion, he heard her voice giving orders in Apache, heard the thunder of hooves, heard his name one last time, Samuel. And then silence, broken only by the sound of the officials shouting and horses disappearing into the distance. When the dust settled, Claire was gone. The warriors had vanished back into the hills, moving too fast to follow, knowing the land too well to be caught. Colonel Briggs stood over Samuel, his face contorted with rage. "You helped them," he snarled. "You interfered with government officials. You aided enemy combatants. You're finished, Garrett. You're worse than finished." Samuel, lying on the ground with blood running from his nose and his ribs aching, began to laugh. It was a wild, half-hysterical sound, the laugh of a man who had just lost everything and found that he did not care. "She's free," he said. "Finally, she's free. And nothing you do to me changes that." They arrested him, of course, bound his hands and threw him onto a horse and took him to town to face charges. Aiding an escape, interfering with officials, conspiracy, a dozen other accusations that would be enough to imprison him for years. The ranch would be confiscated. His life as he knew it was over. But as they rode away, Samuel looked back once toward the eastern hills, toward the direction Claire and her people had fled, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Have felt clean. The trial was swift and brutal. Samuel did not deny the charges. He stood before the territorial judge and admitted everything, without excuse or apology. He explained why he had done what he did, knowing full well his reasons would mean nothing to the court. He spoke about dignity and humanity and the fundamental wrong of treating people as property. The judge, a severe man with no patience for sentiment, cut him short. "Your philosophies are irrelevant, Mr. Garrett," he said. "You broke the law. The law exists for a reason. Without it, we have chaos. You will serve 10 years in the territorial prison." Dismissed. Samuel served 3 years before tuberculosis, rampant in the overcrowded prison, claimed his strength. He died on a cold morning in February, alone in a stone cell, his last thoughts drifting to a young Apache woman whose real name he had never learned, who had taught him that sometimes courage meant sacrificing everything for a single moment of doing what was right. He died believing she had made it to safety, believing his sacrifice had mattered. He died without knowing whether he was right. But his story did not end there, because stories, once started, have a way of spreading, of growing, of taking on lives of their own. The ranch hands who had witnessed what happened talked, despite orders not to. The story of the white rancher who had defied his own people to protect an Apache woman spread through the territory, growing with each telling, becoming legend. Some versions painted Samuel as a fool, others as a saint, still others as a man driven mad by war and guilt. But all versions agreed on one thing: he had tried. And Claire, riding east with her brother and the warriors who had risked their lives to rescue her, carried her own version of the story. In the years that followed, as she lived free on the shrinking reservations, as she married and had children and fought to preserve her people's ways in the face of relentless pressure to assimilate, she told the story of Samuel Garrett. She told it in Apache, preserving its truth in her language. She told it to teach her children that not all white men were the same, that humanity could be found in unexpected places, that even in the darkest times, small acts of mercy mattered. She told it to honor a man who had been, for a brief moment, the difference between death and life, between despair and hope. The ranch itself was sold at auction, bought by Marcus Thorne, who worked it hard and showed no mercy to anyone who suggested there were better ways to live. The house where Samuel and Claire had shared meals and stories burned down 5 years later, struck by lightning during a summer storm. The land remained, indifferent to human drama, accepting whatever use was made of it. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the mist rose from the valley, people claimed they could see 2 figures sitting on the hill where the house once stood, one with dark hair and one with gray, watching the sunrise together. It was nonsense, of course. Ghosts did not exist. But the story persisted anyway, because people needed to believe that sacrifices meant something, that kindness was remembered, that love, in whatever form it took, left marks on the world that could not be entirely erased. The Western Plains are vast and empty, or so they seem to those who do not know how to look. But look closer. Beneath the surface of conquest and progress, beneath the official histories written by victors, there are other stories. Stories of resistance and survival, of small rebellions and quiet acts of conscience, of people who refused to be reduced to categories and roles, who insisted on their own humanity and the humanity of others even when it cost them everything. These stories are harder to find, written in no monuments, celebrated in no holidays. But they are there, waiting for those willing to search, offering testimony to the truth that systems of oppression cannot finally destroy the human capacity for compassion, for connection, for change. Samuel Garrett was not a hero. He was a man complicit in injustice who tried, too late, to do better. Claire was not a victim. She was a survivor who maintained her dignity under conditions designed to strip it away, who seized freedom when it was offered and lived the rest of her life honoring those who had helped her along the way. Their story was not a romance, though it contained love. It was not a redemption, though it contained the attempt at redemption. It was simply a moment in time when two people, separated by everything that history and society could construct, found a way to see each other truly, and in that seeing, found a path towards something better than what had been. The land remembers, even when people forget. The land holds the memory of every tear, every drop of blood, every act of courage and cruelty committed upon its surface. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind moving through the valley, you can hear those memories whispered back, a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the choices we make echo forward through time, that every small act of resistance against dehumanization matters, even if it changes nothing, even if it saves only one person, even if the cost is unbearably high. Because what is the alternative? To accept cruelty as inevitable? To participate in oppression because everyone else does? To close our eyes and hearts and pretend we do not see the suffering we could, if we chose, alleviate? Samuel Garrett chose differently. In the end, that choice cost him everything: his freedom, his livelihood, his life. But it also gave him something he had lost long before, something more valuable than any of the things he had sacrificed. It gave him back his humanity. It gave him the knowledge that when faced with a choice between complicity and conscience, he had finally, after so many years of choosing wrong, chosen right. That knowledge sustained him through his imprisonment and through his death, and beyond in the stories that outlived him. Claire carried his gift of freedom forward, building a life that honored both her people's traditions and the complicated legacy of the man who had protected her. She taught her children and grandchildren to remember that allies could come from unexpected places, that change was possible even in the most rigid systems, that one person's courage could inspire others to find their own. She taught them to be wary, yes, to trust carefully and protect themselves always, but also to recognize the humanity in all people, even those who wore the face of the enemy. It was a difficult balance, honoring both caution and compassion. But Claire had learned to walk difficult paths. She had learned from the best teacher possible: experience. Years later, when she was an old woman with silver threading through her black hair, Claire returned once to the valley where Samuel's ranch had stood. She went alone, telling no one her destination, traveling by horseback across lands that had been redesignated and redistributed a dozen times over. The ranch was gone, the buildings collapsed into ruins. The fences rotted away. But the land remained, the hills rising to the east, the valley spreading west, the sky arcing overhead in endless blue. She stood there for a long time, remembering, and then she knelt and placed her palm flat against the earth, speaking words in Apache that carried on the wind. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for trying. May you find peace wherever you are." Then she rose, mounted her horse, and rode back toward her life, carrying with her the knowledge that some debts could never be fully repaid, some gifts never fully acknowledged, but that the effort to honor them was itself meaningful. The sun set over the valley, painting the mesas in shades of orange and purple and red, the same colors it had painted them for millennia before humans ever walked that land, the same colors it would paint them long after the last human story had been forgotten. In that eternal cycle of light and shadow, the brief, bright moments of human connection and courage seemed almost insignificant, almost lost. But they were there, woven into the fabric of time, proving that even in a world built on conquest and cruelty, love and mercy could still find a way to exist, however briefly, however imperfectly, however costly. And that, perhaps, was enough. That, perhaps, was everything.